"I'm not the girl you left behind," she told the Duke. 8 years after he chose duty over her, she walks back into his house. As the painter hired to capture his portrait, he can't look away. She won't look back. But some things, once unfinished, demand to be completed, including the sketch she never let herself finish all those years ago. Lydia Marsh had passed through the gates of Holloway Court 100 times as a girl, and never once with her hands shaking. They shook now slightly as the carriage rolled up the long avenue of beeches, their leaves gone the color of old gold. She pressed her palms flat against the portfolio in her lap, as if she could still the rest of her by stilling that. 8 years. The gatehouse looked the same, the beeches looked the same. She did not. She had been 20 the last time she sketched in this park, lying on her stomach in damp grass with a young man of 24, refusing to keep his chin still long enough for her to capture the line of his jaw. "You're moving again, Robert." "I'm breathing, Lydia. It's a habit I can't seem to break." She had never finished that sketch. She had told herself for years that it didn't matter, an unfinished thing like so many unfinished things between them. She had not expected, at 8 and 20, to be driving back through these gates as a tradeswoman, hired. The carriage drew to a stop. A footman opened the door and Lydia stepped down onto gravel she remembered the sound of, and looked up at a house she had once known as well as her own, and which now regarded her, she felt, like a stranger. Inside, a tall woman with silver hair, and the bearing of someone who had never once doubted her own opinions, met her in the hall. "Miss Marsh." The voice was crisp, assessing. "I am Lady Frances Sinclair. You'll forgive me for staring. Mr. Aldecott described you as promising. He did not mention you were the daughter of Thomas Marsh." "You knew my father, my lady." "I knew of him. A countryman with a true eye," they said. "Rare enough." Lady Frances's gaze swept over the portfolio under Lydia's arm with open curiosity. "We shall see if the eye runs in the family." "Mrs. Tilden will show you to your room," she added, gesturing to the housekeeper waiting a few steps back. A woman of perhaps 50, grey-eyed, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much to say and when. "You'll take your meals in the small parlour off the morning room, Miss Marsh. I find it suits working guests better than the formal table, and gives you freedom from supper conversation when you'd rather have your evenings to yourself. His Grace does not yet know you've arrived." Lydia's stomach tightened at His Grace, the title sitting strangely over a name she had once said without any title attached to it at all. Mrs. Tilden led her up the staircase without speaking, but at the landing she paused just for a moment and looked at Lydia with something that was not quite surprise. "Marsh," she said slowly. "You'd be Thomas Marsh's girl from the cottage by the mill stream." "I am." "I remember you." Mrs. Tilden's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You used to come up through the orchard gate. Young Mr. Sinclair would meet you there before—" She stopped herself, the practiced discretion of a lifetime closing over whatever she'd nearly said. "Well, it's a long time ago now. It's a long—" "30s," Lydia agreed, and let it lie there between them unexamined the way both of them clearly preferred. Her room was modest but well-appointed. A painter's guest, not quite family, not quite servant, occupying the strange middle territory tradespeople always did in houses like this. She set down her case and, alone at last, opened it. The unfinished sketch was near the bottom, beneath newer work. Portraits of merchants' wives, a baronet's hunting dogs, the unglamorous bread and butter of her trade. She drew it out carefully. Paper soft with age, the charcoal faded but still legible. A young man's face, jaw and throat rendered in confident lines. The mouth left only half suggested, the eyes entirely blank. She had never been able to finish his eyes. She told herself at 20 that she'd simply run out of time before he'd had to leave. She knew now it had been something else, that some part of her had understood even then that to finish him was to let him go, and she had not been ready to do that. She was not 20 now. She put the sketch away and went down to her supper in the small parlour, eaten alone, and told herself the shaking in her hands was only the cold. She did not see him until the next morning, in the gallery itself rather than any shared table, and by then she had composed herself into something steadier, until he walked through the door and the composure went out of her like breath. He had grown into the height that had always threatened him as a young man, broad through the shoulder, in a way that filled out a coat properly now. His hair was darker than she remembered, or she had simply forgotten how dark it truly was. But the eyes were the same, Grey, direct, the particular way he had of looking at a person, as though he intended to remember everything about the moment. He stopped in the doorway. "Lydia!" Just that. Not Miss Marsh. 8 years and the title's worth of distance between them, and he said her given name as though no time had passed at all, as though it cost him something to say it correctly, formally, and he had simply failed. "Your Grace," she said with careful precision, and watched something in his face flinch at the correction. "You're the painter Aldecott recommended." "I am a painter," Mr. Aldecott recommended. "He doesn't know there's a difference." A muscle moved in Robert's jaw. No, he wouldn't. Lady Frances, entering behind him with the unhurried confidence of someone who had timed her arrival to miss nothing, looked between them with frank interest. "You know each other." "We were neighbours," Lydia said, "a long time ago." "Were you?" Lady Frances's eyes were bright with the particular delight of a woman who had just discovered her house party would not be dull. "How extraordinary that Aldecott should think to recommend you, of all the portraitists in England." "Extraordinary," Robert echoed, his voice flat in a way that suggested he found it nothing of the kind, that he suspected even now some hand of fate or mischief in it, and resented either possibility. "I assure you, Your Grace," Lydia said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he'd entered the room, "I did not seek the commission out. Had I known whose face I was engaged to paint, I might have declined it." "Might you?" Something in his expression sharpened, not quite anger, something closer to challenge. "And yet you didn't decline." "No," she said. "I find I am rather better than I used to be at finishing what I begin." It landed exactly as she'd meant it to. She watched him absorb it, watched the flicker behind his eyes that told her the words had found their mark. "I'm not the girl you left waiting, and I am not leaving this unfinished a second time, even if it cost me something to sit across from you and prove it." Lady Frances, sensing currents she could not entirely chart but thoroughly enjoyed, clapped her hands together once. "Well, the light in the East Gallery is excellent of a morning. I suggest you begin there, and soon. His Grace cannot sit still for anything longer than a fortnight, before his nerves get the better of him." "They do not," Robert said. "They absolutely do," said Lady Frances, already turning to go. "Ask anyone." She left them in a silence that neither seemed inclined to fill. "Tomorrow morning, then," Lydia said finally. 10 o'clock, the East Gallery." "I know where the East Gallery is," Robert said. "I have lived here rather longer than you have this time." "I am aware, Your Grace." She gathered her portfolio. "I shall try not to keep you from your nerves." She left before he could answer, and did not allow herself to look back to see his face. That night in her room, she took out the unfinished sketch again. She studied the blank eyes for a long moment, charcoal pencil in hand, and then put it away again without touching it. Not yet. The East Gallery held the kind of light painters dreamed of. High windows facing the rising sun, the old portraits of Sinclair dukes lining the walls like a row of solemn witnesses to whatever was about to happen beneath them. Lydia arranged her easel near the largest window, and was laying out her materials when Robert arrived, exactly on the hour, dressed plainly for sitting. "You're punctual," she said, not looking up. "I find punctuality easier than most things lately." She glanced at him then, a flicker of something almost like humour in his face gone as quickly as it appeared. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair she'd positioned, "and don't speak for the first quarter hour. I need to see your face at rest before I see it doing anything at all." He sat. He did not, as it turned out, find silence easy either. She could feel his attention on her the way one feels weather changing, a pressure in the room rather than anything she could point to. She worked in quiet for the first stretch, blocking in the shape of him with quick, sure strokes, and tried not to notice how much of the work was simply remembering. "You hold your pencil the same way," he said, breaking the silence before the quarter hour was up. "I told you not to speak." "You did. I find I'm rather better than I used to be at ignoring instructions I dislike." She allowed herself a small, unwilling smile, quickly suppressed. "Your father would be appalled to hear you developed a flaw." "My father is dead, Lydia. He is past being appalled by anything I do." He said it without self-pity, simply a fact laid down between them, and something in Lydia's chest went still at the bluntness of it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I hadn't heard when." 8 years ago. His brother's name, spoken plainly, and she understood at once what those two losses, years apart, must have done to the order of his life. The long interval of waiting, a title hovering unclaimed while his father lived on, and the weight of it settled slowly onto his shoulders regardless. I held the courtesy title after Edward died, Marquis of Faulkner, for what little comfort there was in it. My father lived 2 years more. I was Duke when he followed. I didn't know any of it, she said quietly. About Edward, I'm sorry, truly. Why would you have known you weren't here? It wasn't cruel the way he said it, it was simply true, and they both heard the weight underneath it. You weren't here, because I sent you away, before any of this had even finished happening to me. She said nothing. She picked up a different pencil and began the careful work of his jaw, the line she had never finished at 20. You're very quiet now, he observed. You asked me not to speak, and now you're upset that I've taken the advice. She didn't look up from the page. Hold your chin steady. You're moving. I'm breathing, he said. It's a habit I can't seem to break. Her pencil stopped. She had not expected him to remember the exact words. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the old joke hanging in the space between them, transformed by 8 years into something with teeth. You remember that, she said finally, carefully. I remember a great many things, Lydia. His voice had lost its lightness. I find that's rather the trouble. She made herself return to the page, because there was nothing else to do with her hands, and because if she looked at him directly just then, she was afraid of what her face might give away. The sittings continued through the week, an hour each morning, and became, without either of them quite naming it, the part of the day Lydia found herself anticipating despite every resolution to feel nothing of the kind. He was not, she came to notice, the same man who had let her go. Or rather, he was, but the long years of waiting first as heir, then as duke, had worn certain things into him that hadn't been there before. A carefulness, a habit of weighing his words before he spoke them, as though every sentence might be repeated to someone who'd use it against him. She found herself wanting, against her better judgment, to know what had put it there. You watch the door, she said one morning, mid-sitting, when he'd glanced toward it for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Do I? Oh, you do. You did it as a boy, too, when your father was due home. She kept her eyes on the canvas. Old habits. Something flickered across his face, surprised that she'd noticed or surprised that she remembered. My aunt has taken to walking in unannounced. I've learned to listen for her. Is that truly what unsettles you? Lady Frances's footsteps? He was quiet a moment. No, he admitted, not entirely. She did not press him on what entirely it was. She suspected she already knew, and suspected too that naming it aloud would cost more than either of them was prepared to pay, that early in the week. It was Mrs. Tilden who broke the careful surface of things first, not through any intention to meddle, but because 30 years of running a household had given her a sharp eye for what people tried to hide, and very little patience for pretending she hadn't seen it. She found Lydia in the gallery one afternoon, cleaning brushes after the day's sitting. The room emptied of everyone but the two of them, and the long row of painted dukes watching from the walls. You've a steady hand, Mrs. Tilden said, setting down a tray of tea Lydia hadn't asked for but was grateful for nonetheless. Steadier than I'd have guessed given the circumstances. What circumstances would those be, Mrs. Tilden? I think you know. The housekeeper's grey eyes were not unkind. I was here, Miss Marsh, the summer it ended. I don't pretend to know everything that passed between you and the young master. That wasn't my business then, and isn't now. But I remember a girl who used to wait by the orchard gate, and I remember the day she stopped coming, and I remember the look on his face the morning after, like something had gone out of him he didn't know how to ask for back. Lydia's hands stilled on the brush she was cleaning. He chose his duty, Mrs. Tilden. That isn't a mystery requiring solving. No, Mrs. Tilden agreed, but I've watched that man wear his duty like a coat too small for him for years now, and I'll tell you something for nothing, since you're not one of the family, and I'm not obliged to mind my tongue with you the way I would with them. She picked up the empty teacup, businesslike again. He's never once looked as unsettled at his own breakfast as he has this past week, asking after whether the painter's taken her tray yet. Make of that what you will. She left before Lydia could find an answer, and Lydia sat a long while in the quiet gallery afterward, the brushes forgotten in her hands, turning Mrs. Tilden's words over and trying very hard not to want what they implied. Mr. Aldecott arrived 3 days later for a fortnight's visit, a cheerful white-haired gentleman who had been a friend of Lydia's father and had clearly forgotten, in the simple pleasure of reunion, that the past held any complications at all. He found her in the small parlour where she took her meals, and rather than let her dine in peace, drew up a chair uninvited, delighted beyond measure to have discovered her there. "Lydia Marsh, as I live and breathe." He took both her hands, beaming. "The very image of your father, my dear. He'd be proud beyond speaking to see you painting dukes now instead of squires' spaniels." "You're very kind, sir." "Kind? Nonsense, it's simple truth." He settled in, entirely unaware that this private parlour existed precisely, so Lydia might avoid exchanges such as this one. "Do you know, this girl used to run wild through the Holloway orchards as a child, thick as thieves with young Mr. Sinclair, the pair of them, before he was His Grace and she was off making her name in Bath. I remember old Marsh saying he half expected—" "Mr. Aldecott." Lady Francis's voice came from the doorway, smooth but final, though her eyes were bright with interest rather than censure. She had clearly come looking for him, and arrived at exactly the wrong, or Lydia suspected exactly the right, moment. "I believe you promised to tell me about the Italian opera you saw in London. Do come and tell it properly, over sherry." Aldecott, easily redirected, allowed himself to be led off, entirely unaware of what he'd disturbed, and Lydia sat alone afterward with her cooling supper, her composure considerably more shaken than she would have liked to admit. She did not see Robert that evening. She rather thought Lady Francis had arranged that too. She found him the next afternoon in the long gallery, alone, standing before a window with his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture she recognized, the same stillness he held when he was working very hard not to feel something. "Aldecott told you, I expect," he said before she could speak, not turning. "Or someone did. He's an old man with a fond memory and no idea what he's disturbed. He told me a great deal actually before your aunt rescued him from himself." She came to stand a careful distance from him, near enough to speak quietly, far enough to keep this, whatever this was, at arm's length. "It was a long time ago." "It doesn't feel like it." He turned to face her, said it simply, without performance, and the honesty of it disarmed her more than any practiced charm could have. "I find I remember it rather better than I ought to, considering how poorly I handled the end of it." "Robert!" It was the first time she'd said his name since arriving, no title, no careful distance, and she heard him hear it, saw something in his face open just slightly at the sound of it. "I haven't finished the portrait," she said instead of whatever else she might have said, retreating to safer ground. "We've 4 sittings yet before I can call it done." "I know." A faint, rueful curve at the corner of his mouth. "I find I'm in no particular hurry for it to end." He stepped toward the easel she'd left set up at the gallery's far end, looking at the half-finished canvas with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and dread, the way a man might look at evidence about himself he wasn't certain he wanted produced. "May I look properly?" She hesitated, then nodded. He studied it a long moment in silence. She had caught something of him she hadn't entirely intended, not the composed, dutiful duke he presented to dinner tables and tenant meetings, but something more unguarded beneath it, visible in the set of the mouth, the watchfulness around the eyes. "You've made me look as though I'm waiting for something," he said quietly. "Are you not?" He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he reached out, almost without thinking, to adjust the easel's angle toward the better light, and his hand came to rest beside hers on the wooden frame, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without either of them quite touching. Neither of them moved. "Lydia!" "Don't," she said softly, though she didn't step back either. "Whatever you're about to say, not yet. I'm not ready to hear it yet." He went still, and then, after a long moment, withdrew his hand, the loss of its nearness leaving a small, specific cold behind it. "Then I'll wait," he said. "I find I've had practice." It was, she thought afterward, the closest either of them had come to saying anything true since she'd arrived, and it left her standing alone in the gallery long after he'd gone, her heart going entirely too fast for a woman who had told herself, repeatedly, that she had stopped being foolish about this man years ago. The house party gathered in full by the second week, neighbouring families, a baronet's unmarried sons, a clutch of young ladies whose mothers had clearly calculated the value of an unwed duke's attention with the precision of accountants. Lydia, dining apart from the formal table as her position required, nonetheless found herself drawn into the drawing-room of an evening, when Lady Francis took to inviting her in for cards or conversation as a working guest of the house rather than a servant of it. A small deliberate elevation that did not go unnoticed by anyone present. She watched it all with the particular detachment of someone who knew herself to be outside the game being played, even as some traitorous part of her chest tightened every time one of those young ladies laughed too brightly at something Robert said. It was Lady Frances who summoned her one afternoon to the small parlour, ostensibly to discuss the portrait's progress, and who watched Lydia over the rim of her teacup with an attention far too sharp for idle conversation. "You paint him as though you know him," she said. "Not merely his face, the man underneath it." "I knew him once, my lady. Some things are difficult to unlearn." Lady Frances set down her cup. "I'll tell you something, Miss Marsh, since I am old enough now to say what I like, and call it the privilege of age. My nephew has been, since his father died, a man performing dutifulness rather convincingly to everyone but those of us who knew him before he had to. I had begun to wonder if the performance had become the whole of him." She studied Lydia with frank, unhurried interest. "He has not performed anything in your company. I find that rather more interesting than the portrait." Lydia chose her words with care. "Whatever passed between us was a long time ago, and ended for reasons that haven't changed. Hasn't it?" Lady Frances's eyebrow lifted, delicate and devastating. "I find the reasons men give themselves for unhappiness rarely survive close examination, Miss Marsh, but I shan't press you. I am merely an old woman who likes to know how a story ends before everyone else does." She rose, the conversation apparently concluded by her own design, and left Lydia sitting with a teacup gone cold and a question she had no intention of answering honestly, even to herself. The evening of cards came 3 nights later, the drawing-room lit warm against the autumn dark. Half the house party gathered around tables, while a young lady played indifferently at the pianoforte in the corner. Lydia had been invited to make up a table, Lady Frances's doing, she suspected, seating her directly across from Robert with the satisfied air of a woman arranging furniture exactly where she wanted it. It was Miss Pelham, pretty, sharp-tongued, one of the calculating mother's daughters, who raised it lightly between hands of cards, the way one might mention weather. "Miss Marsh, is it true you and his Grace were childhood playfellows? Mr. Aldecott mentioned something of the sort, though I confess I hardly credited it." Her smile was bright, knowing. "How droll to think of a duke running about an orchard with a tradesman's daughter." The table's attention shifted, subtle but unmistakable, toward Lydia. She felt Robert's eyes on her, still watching. She understood with sudden clarity that this was a moment with weight, that whatever she said next would settle into the house's memory of her. "We were neighbours, Miss Pelham," Lydia said evenly, laying down a card. "Children share a great deal of time together in the country, with rather less to remark upon than London imagines." "How disappointing!" Miss Pelham laughed, but her eyes stayed sharp. "I had hoped for something scandalous. I'm afraid provincial childhoods are dreadfully short on scandal." It might have ended there had Robert not spoken, though he chose his words, Lydia would notice afterward, with considerably more care than the moment Aldecott's tongue had run away with him. "Miss Marsh's father was a man I respected a great deal," he said to the table generally, his voice even, almost bored, the tone of a man settling a trivial matter rather than confessing anything. "He was the finest painter in the county, and I'll not have his daughter's skill discussed as though it were a curiosity rather than a craft. I'd take it as a kindness if we returned to the cards." It was nothing on its surface, the mildest possible defence, a duke correcting a guest's manners rather than a man laying bare an old wound. No understanding confessed, no scandal confirmed. But Lydia, watching his face, saw what the table could not, that he had chosen deliberately to spend a little of his authority shielding her, in the only form propriety allowed him. "Of course, Your Grace," Miss Pelham murmured, chastened. "I meant no offence, I'm sure." "None taken," he said, and the game resumed, awkward and quickly recovering. But Lydia sat very still, her cards forgotten in her hand, something cracking open in her chest that she had spent 8 years carefully keeping shut. She found him afterward in the corridor outside the drawing-room, the card party's noise fading behind a closed door, the two of them alone in candlelight that left half his face in shadow. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "Perhaps not." He didn't look remotely repentant. "I find I no longer particularly care for the kind of conversation that treats your father's trade, or yours, as entertainment for an idle table, Lydia. I cared a great deal once about exactly that, what people concluded, what was owed to the name, what a duke could and couldn't be seen to want." His voice roughened slightly. "It cost me the one thing I actually wanted. I find I've lost my taste for the bargain." "That isn't yours to decide on my behalf," she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "You don't get to defend my father's good name at a card table and call the whole debt settled, Robert. That isn't how this works." "I know that." "Do you?" Something in her finally gave way, 8 years of carefully maintained distance breaking against the plain fact of him standing there, sincere, too late by years and somehow still standing there anyway. "I'm not the girl you left waiting by the orchard gate. I built a life with my own hands while you were deciding I wasn't worth the risk of keeping. I don't need you to defend me. I needed you to choose me all those years ago, when it would have cost you something and you didn't." The words landed exactly as hard as she meant them to. She watched him absorb the blow without flinching from it, watched something in his face crack open with what looked unmistakably like grief for his own failure. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know you're right. I've known it for years." "Then you understand why I can't simply—" She stopped, breathing carefully, steadying herself against a feeling too large for the corridor they stood in. "I need distance, Robert, from whatever this is becoming. I came here to finish a portrait, not to relive something I already survived once." "Lydia, please." It came out softer than she intended, more plea than command. "Give me that much." He looked at her a long moment, long enough that she nearly took the request back, nearly closed the distance between them herself. And then he stepped back, deliberately, putting space between them with visible effort. "All right," he said. "If that's what you need, you'll have it." He turned and walked back into the drawing room's noise and light, leaving her alone in the candle-lit corridor, her heart aching in a way she hadn't let it ache in 8 long years, uncertain whether she'd won something or lost it. 3 days of distance taught Robert nothing he hadn't already known, except how much louder a house could be, with one person deliberately absent from every room he entered. Lydia kept to the gallery in the mornings, finishing the portrait's background with the door shut against him. She took her meals in the small parlour, as arranged, and lingered there longer than the work required, simply to avoid the rest of the house. In the afternoons she walked, alone deliberately, choosing paths that did not pass anywhere near the stables or the home wood, where she knew from old habit he was likely to be found. She told Lady Frances it was for the work, and Lady Frances, who missed nothing and pressed nothing she didn't intend to win, allowed her the lie with an expression that suggested she believed perhaps a third of it. On the second morning, Lydia found she could not make the portrait's hands sit right. She had blocked them in a fortnight earlier, resting loosely on the arm of the chair, and now, returning to refine them, she found her pencil unwilling to cooperate, as though some part of her resisted finishing a likeness of a man she had just told, in no uncertain terms, that she required distance from. She set down the pencil, frustrated, and went instead to the window, looking out over the parkland gone the colour of weak tea in the autumn light. Somewhere below, she could see a small figure on horseback moving along the tree line. Robert, she was nearly certain, riding alone, no groom in attendance, the particular posture of a man who had gone out to be away from his own house rather than toward anything in particular. She watched him until he passed out of sight beyond the wood, and told herself, without much conviction, that she felt nothing in particular about it. So it was Mrs. Tilden who finally broke the standoff, arriving at Lydia's door on the third evening, with a tray Lydia hadn't ordered, and an expression that brooked no argument. "His Grace is in the library," she said, setting the tray down with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had carried 10,000 trays in her life and intended this one to matter more than most. "He's been there an hour, not reading. I thought you should know, in case you wanted to not go and see him, with the full facts in hand. I'll walk you down myself and see to it the household knows where you both are. There's no impropriety in a conversation, Miss Marsh, provided it's not conducted in secret." "That's not quite a kindness, Mrs. Tilden." "No," the housekeeper agreed, entirely unrepentant. "It's interference with the proprieties observed. I've earned the right to both at my age, having watched the pair of you make the same mistakes twice now from opposite directions." "The same mistakes," Lydia repeated. "I haven't made any mistakes, Mrs. Tilden. I was the one who was left." "You were." Mrs. Tilden's grey eyes were steady, unflinching, the look of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 duchesses and had no patience left for delicacy. "And now you're punishing the man who's trying, 8 years too late, to put it right because it's safer than trusting him. I'm not saying you're wrong to be careful, Miss Marsh. I'm saying careful and cowardly aren't always easy to tell apart, even for the people doing the choosing." She left before Lydia could find an answer to that, which Lydia suspected had been entirely the point. Lydia sat a long while after she'd gone, the tray untouched, the old unfinished sketch lying on the table where she'd left it that morning, blank-eyed and waiting. She thought of Robert at the card table, spending his authority to shield her in the only way propriety allowed. She thought of 8 years and of being tired, genuinely, finally tired, of being the only one who remembered exactly what had been lost. She thought, too, of Mrs. Tilden's word, cowardly, and found uncomfortably that she could not entirely dismiss it. She went down to the library. The library at Holloway Court sat at the far end of the west wing, removed enough from the family rooms that even Lady Frances rarely ventured there of an evening, which was precisely, Lydia suspected, why Robert had chosen it. Mrs. Tilden walked the corridor with her, unhurried, and stopped a deliberate distance from the door, settling herself into a chair set against the corridor wall with the comfortable air of a woman who had no intention of leaving and no intention of listening either. "The door stays open, Your Grace," she called through it, before Lydia had even crossed the threshold, in a voice clearly meant to be heard. "I'll be just here with my mending, should anyone wonder where Miss Marsh has got to." Robert, caught mid-thought by the cold hearth, looked toward the door with an expression that suggested he'd forgotten, for the length of 3 days brooding, that the world contained housekeepers at all. He had not expected company. His coat hung over the back of a chair, and his cravat had been loosened in the unthinking way of a man alone with his own thoughts, and he reached for the coat now, faintly colour rising at being caught so unguarded. "Forgive me," he said, drawing it back on. "I wasn't expecting—" "I didn't give you much warning," Lydia said. "Mrs. Tilden's doing, not mine. I gathered that, given she's announced herself to the entire corridor." A faint, unsteady smile, gone as quickly as it came. He gestured to the chair nearest the hearth, leaving the door and the distance, exactly as Mrs. Tilden had arranged them. "Will you sit?" "You came," he said. "Mrs. Tilden has opinions about interference, and very little shame about acting on them. She always did." A faint, unsteady smile, gone as quickly as it came. "She used to tell my father he was raising a boy who'd grow up afraid of his own shadow if someone didn't toughen him. He never forgave her for it, and never dismissed her either, which I've always thought said something true about both of them." "Robert," she said his name carefully, a kind of warning. "I didn't come to talk about your father's housekeeper." "No." He drew a breath. "You didn't. Forgive me. I find I've rehearsed several openings to this conversation over the last 3 days, and none of them survive the moment you're actually standing in front of me." "Then don't rehearse, just say it." He was quiet a moment, studying her in the candlelight, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost whatever careful performance he'd been attempting. "Lydia, I don't expect you to forgive what I did. I'm not even certain I'd know what to do with your forgiveness if you offered it outright. I think some part of me has spent 8 years believing I didn't deserve to be let off easily, and I'm not sure I trust an easy absolution even now. But I find I can't let you finish that portrait and leave Holloway Court believing I never intended to account for myself properly. You deserve the accounting. Even years late, even if it changes nothing between us." "Why now?" she asked. "Why not the first week? Why let me watch you defend my father's good name at a card table and say nothing honest until I asked for distance?" It was a fair question, and she watched him take it seriously, the way he took most things now that she hadn't expected of the boy he'd been. "Because I was a coward then too," he said simply. "Telling you the truth at the card table in front of witnesses would have cost me nothing real. It would have looked like gallantry. Telling you the truth here, alone, where you can ask me anything you like, and I have nowhere to hide from the answer, that costs something. I find I've grown rather good this past decade at choosing the version of honesty that costs the least. I'm trying very hard tonight not to do that." Lydia said nothing, but she came further into the room and settled into the chair nearest the cold hearth, which he seemed to understand as the only permission he was likely to get. "Tell me," she said, "all of it, properly this time." He told her. He told her about the spring Edward had taken the fever, sudden, vicious, the physicians useless against it, the whole household holding its breath for a fortnight before it was over. He told her about the funeral, his father grey and silent through the whole of it, and the 3 days afterward when no one had spoken to Robert about anything beyond condolence, until the 4th day, when his father had called him into the estate office and, without preamble, begun discussing the entail. "He didn't grieve where anyone could see it," Robert said. "I think he didn't know how by then. He'd buried a wife and now a son, and grief had become a country he'd stopped visiting. He turned all of it into arithmetic instead. The estate's debts, the tenants' rents falling short for 3 years running. What a Marquess of Faulkner required, now that there was one, and what a future Duke of Holloway could not be permitted to want if the title was going to survive the century. He said that in those words? Not those words precisely. He didn't need to be so plain. He simply began, very deliberately, inviting certain families to dine. Miss Hartwell, that first autumn, you'll not have known her. She married a baron's son the following spring, and I believe is perfectly happy, which I am glad of. Then a Miss Devereux the following year. He never once forbade me from seeing you. He was too careful a man for anything so crude as a prohibition I might have resisted simply for being told to. He simply made it very clear, through 2 years of careful arrangement, what kind of life he expected me to choose, and let the choosing feel like it was entirely my own. And was it your own choosing? Robert was quiet a long moment. I've asked myself that more than any other question these 8 years, he said finally. I want to tell you it wasn't, that I was simply too young, too grieved, too unprepared for the weight of it to resist him properly. But I think that would be its own kind of cowardice, Lydia. The truth is uglier than that. Some part of me agreed with him. Some part of me looked at you, at the girl I loved more than anything I'd ever known, and thought, she is not enough armor against what's coming. I was afraid of failing the name. I was afraid, I think, of failing Edward somehow, by wanting something so far beneath what he'd have been expected to want, as though loving you was itself a kind of disrespect to a brother who'd never been given the choice at all. And it was so much easier to dress all of that fear up as duty and let it cost you, than to admit I simply didn't yet have the courage to want you and carry this title at the same time. The library was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the windows an owl called once and went silent. That's the first true thing you've said to me in 8 years, Lydia said softly. I know. It doesn't undo it. I know that too. He didn't move toward her, though she could see how much it cost him to hold still, his hands loosely fisted at his sides. I'm not asking you to act as though it didn't happen. I'm not even certain what I'm asking you for tonight, beyond the chance to say it properly once before you finish that portrait and have every reason in the world to leave Holloway Court and never think of me again. Do you imagine that's what I want? To never think of you again? I don't know what you want, Lydia. I've spent 8 years not knowing, and I find I've grown rather frightened of guessing wrong. She rose from the chair then, slowly, and crossed to where the old unfinished sketch sat in her case by the door. She had brought it with her, she realized only now, without entirely deciding to. I kept it, she said, drawing it out. The sketch, the one I never finished. She held it out to him. He took it carefully as though it might dissolve in his hands, and studied the young, unfinished version of his own face, jaw and throat rendered in confident, certain lines, the mouth only half suggested, the eyes entirely blank. You kept it, he said. Not a question this time, something closer to wonder. I told myself it was only an unfinished piece of work, that I disliked leaving things incomplete, and that's simply a flaw of temperament rather than sentiment. Her voice wavered, just slightly. It wasn't only that, Robert. I think some part of me has been waiting 8 years to find out whether I'd ever be able to finish it, whether there'd ever be a version of you in front of me worth finishing. And is there? I don't know yet. She made herself say it honestly, though it cost her. I think I'm only just beginning to find out. He set the old sketch down on the desk with a care that told her exactly how much it meant to him, and then he closed the distance between them, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and didn't. Lydia. Her name again, the way he'd said it that first morning, as though it cost him something, except now she understood exactly what it cost, and exactly why he was willing to pay it. May I? Yes, she said before he'd finished asking. He kissed her the way a man kisses something he has spent years convincing himself he was no longer permitted to want. Carefully at first, almost disbelieving, his hand coming up to rest against her jaw, as though she might still vanish if he held her too lightly. She felt the whole of the last 8 years rearrange itself around the single fact of his mouth against hers, gentle and certain, and she let her hand close over the front of his loosened shirt, steadying herself against him, because her knees had gone entirely unreliable. He drew back only slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breath unsteady. Tell me to stop if you want me to stop. I don't want you to stop, she admitted, and felt him exhale against her, something between relief and disbelief, before he kissed her again, less careful this time, more certain. his hand sliding from her jaw to the curve of her neck, drawing her closer with a kind of quiet urgency that told her exactly how long he had wanted this and exactly how hard he had worked to seem otherwise. It was not a long kiss. It was not, she would think later, even a particularly bold one by the standards of whatever novels Miss Pelham no doubt favoured, but it undid something in her that had been carefully, deliberately fastened shut for 8 years, and she felt it come loose all at once, a kind of vertigo, as though she had been holding her breath since she was 20 years old and had only just remembered how to release it. A clock somewhere in the room struck the half-hour, the small sound startling them both apart. Robert drew back, breathing unsteadily, his forehead resting briefly against hers. "I ought to let you return before anyone marks how long you've been gone from your room." "That would be wise," Lydia agreed, though she made no move to step away, and neither for several seconds did he. "Lydia," his thumb traced once lightly along her jaw, "I don't intend to let this go a second time. I want you to hear me say that plainly, not as something whispered in a dark library where it costs me nothing to mean it." "Don't promise me that tonight," she said low, though there was no real resistance left in her voice. "Promise me that in the daylight, when you've had time to mean it properly, and I've had time to be certain I believe you." "I'll promise it every morning until you believe me," he said, "if that's what it takes. I find I've discovered rather a talent for patience this past decade. I may as well put it to good use." She laughed softly, surprised by her own capacity for it after everything the evening had carried, and he smiled back at her, an unguarded, boyish thing she hadn't seen on his face since she was 20 years old and certain of everything. He stepped back at last, reluctantly, and Lydia slipped from the library by the corridor she'd come in by, her heart unsteady, her mouth still warm, the ache she'd carried for 8 years transformed into something far more dangerous. Hope. She did not see him alone again for 2 days. Holloway Court's household had a way of swallowing privacy whole once a house party reached its 2nd week, and Lydia told herself the distance was sensible, even as it cost her considerably more than the first distance had. The 2 days were not idle, however. She returned to the portrait with a steadiness she hadn't possessed before the library, and found, to her own surprise, that the hands she'd struggled over now resolved themselves easily beneath her pencil. Loose, at rest, a man no longer watching the door. She worked through the mornings with a focus that felt almost like relief, as though some obstruction in her had finally cleared. It was on the 2nd afternoon that Lady Frances found her in the gallery, ostensibly to inquire after the portrait's progress, though Lydia had begun to suspect Lady Frances's inquiries were rarely as simple as they appeared. "You look different today, Miss Marsh," Lady Frances observed, settling into the chair Lydia kept for sitters' families to watch from, though none had used it in weeks. "Less like a woman holding her breath." "I couldn't say what's changed, my lady." "No, I don't imagine you could." Lady Frances's eyes were bright with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knew a great deal more than she was saying and intended to enjoy the knowing for as long as possible. "My nephew came to me yesterday evening. Did he tell you he intended to?" Lydia's pencil stilled. "He did not." "Well, he has now done it regardless of whether he warned you, which I think rather speaks to the seriousness of the thing. A man rehearsing a speech to an audience of one elderly aunt isn't generally doing it for sport." Lady Frances folded her hands. "He told me in this very room that his regard for you was of long standing, that he intended to ask for your hand if you would have him, and that he wished for my blessing, though he was careful to note he did not require my permission, as he is, after all, the Duke, and accountable to no one's opinion but his own and yours." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him," Lady Frances said with the air of someone enjoying a memory thoroughly, "that he was a great fool to have waited 8 years to say so, and that I had half a mind to be cross with him on your behalf for the whole of the wasted decade. And then I told him I was delighted, and asked what I ought to wear to the wedding, which I confess I had already begun planning before he'd finished his sentence." Lydia felt something warm and unsteady rise in her chest. "He hasn't asked me anything yet, my lady." "No," Lady Frances agreed, rising with the satisfaction of a woman who had delivered exactly the message she'd intended to. "But I expect he shall, and rather soon, and I expect you already know what your answer will be, whatever face you're presently putting on for my benefit." She paused at the door. "I was very fond of your father, Miss Marsh. He painted my portrait once when I was younger than you are now, and told me I had the look of a woman who'd outlive everyone fool enough to underestimate her. I rather think you've inherited the eye for character, along with the skill for paint. Don't underestimate my nephew simply because he was a fool for 2 years of his life. Most men manage considerably longer than that." She left, and Lydia sat a long while afterward with her pencil forgotten, smiling despite every effort to compose herself into something more dignified. It was, she reflected later, a far cry from the breakfast table announcement she'd half feared after the card room. No public confession, no scandal handed to Miss Pelham and her like to chew over for a fortnight. Robert had gone instead to the one person whose good opinion he genuinely wanted, and secured it quietly, properly, in a manner that left no room for gossip and every room for sincerity. By the time he came to find her in the gallery the following afternoon, she understood that the household already knew, through the only channel that mattered, that his intentions were entirely honourable and entirely serious. The portrait stood nearly finished on its easel, only the eyes left wanting their final depth, the rest of him rendered with a steadiness she hadn't quite managed 8 years ago. She had been working on the hands again when he entered, and did not look up immediately, though she felt the change in the room the moment he crossed the threshold. "My aunt tells me she intends to claim full credit for this," he said by way of greeting. "Should you accept me? She's already informed Mrs. Tilden which rooms ought to be aired for a wedding breakfast, on the theory that preparation never hurt anyone and might as well begin before the question's even been asked." "Accept you for what, precisely? You haven't yet asked me anything." "No." He came to stand near the easel, close enough that she set down her pencil entirely, giving up any pretense of working. "I find I wanted to do this part properly this time, rather than in front of an audience at a card table, where I'd have made it sound like gallantry instead of what it actually is." "And what is it actually?" 8 years of being wrong about the one thing I should have been certain of." He said it simply, without flourish, and she found she believed him entirely. She glanced toward the desk drawer where she'd left the old sketch, since that night in the library. Neither of them had spoken of it since, though she suspected he'd thought of it as often as she had. "You still haven't asked me what I mean to do with it," she said. "The old sketch." "I assumed you'd tell me when you'd decided." He came to stand beside her at the easel. "Have you decided?" "I think I'm ready to finish it. Properly this time, not the boy I left half-drawn at 20, but the man sitting in front of me now." She nodded toward the newer canvas on the easel. "Same unfinished business, different face." He set the old sketch down and reached for her hand, his thumb tracing once over her knuckles. Careful, deliberate, the same way he'd touched her jaw in the library. "Lydia Marsh." His voice was steady, none of the breakfast table's recklessness in it, only quiet certainty. "I am not offering you a title or an estate or anything a sensible woman ought to want for its own sake. Though I'll admit the estate comes attached, and I'm told the roof wants mending in the east wing, so you'd not be entirely without occupation. I'm offering you a man who spent 8 years learning, slowly and badly, that duty without love is simply another word for cowardice. I love you. I think I have never entirely stopped, not for a single day of those 8 years, however well I hid it even from myself, and however poorly I deserve after everything to say so now and expect to be believed. Will you marry me?" She did not answer immediately, not from hesitation, but because the moment seemed to require, after 8 years of waiting, to be held a little longer before she let it go. "You mentioned the roof," she said finally, her voice not quite steady. "Before you mentioned anything resembling romance. I find I'm better with estates than with speeches. I've had considerably more practice." "Yes," she said. "Yes, Robert, I will marry you." He kissed her again, there in the gallery beneath the long row of painted dukes, slower and surer than the first time, nothing left to interrupt them, no distant clock to startle them apart. When at last they drew apart, she found she was laughing, lightly, helplessly. The particular laughter of a woman who has spent 8 years braced against a grief that has just, unexpectedly, turned into joy. "Lady Frances will be insufferable," she said. "Lady Frances has been insufferable since the moment you arrived," Robert said. "I see no reason for either of us to expect that to change. She's already chosen her gown, you understand. I'd brace yourself." "I rather think I shall enjoy being the second most insufferable woman in this house then," Lydia said, "since the position appears to be available." The news travelled through Holloway Court with the particular speed reserved for tidings that flatter everyone who repeats them. Mrs. Tilden wept openly in the still room, to absolutely no one's surprise, and then set about reorganizing the household's linen stores as though a wedding might be sprung upon them within the week. Mr. Aldecott, informed at dinner, rose from his chair so abruptly he overturned a glass of claret and seemed not to notice, declaring to the assembled table that he had always known, always, that Thomas Marsh's girl would come to something remarkable, though he had perhaps not anticipated quite this particular remarkableness. Miss Pelham took the news with rather less grace, offering Lydia a congratulation so brittle it might have cracked on contact, before departing the house party a full week earlier than planned, citing a sudden obligation to her aunt in Bath that no one at Holloway Court found especially convincing. Lydia did not mind. She found, in fact, that she minded remarkably little about anything Miss Pelham thought, now that the matter that had once made her vulnerable to such opinions had resolved itself so thoroughly in her favour. They were married in December, in the small stone church in the village, with frost on the windows and holly along the sills, and a congregation considerably smaller than Holloway Court's grandeur might have suggested. Lady Frances in the front pew, fiercely triumphant, wearing precisely the gown she'd promised herself. Mrs. Tilden near the back, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief and denying it fiercely to anyone who asked. Mr. Aldecott beaming as though he had engineered the entire affair himself, which he had in his own unwitting way, and was perfectly content to take full credit for at every opportunity. Lydia wore blue, not white, a practical woman's choice, she told Lady Frances, who declared it scandalous and then wore an identical shade to the wedding breakfast in solidarity, a coincidence the entire village discussed for weeks afterward as though it had been a matter of state. The vicar, an elderly man who had known both their fathers, spoke briefly and well of constancy, and Lydia found herself thinking, as Robert's hand closed around hers before the altar, that constancy was perhaps not quite the right word for what they'd managed. Something closer to a long, difficult correction, two people finding their way back to a truth they'd once been too frightened to hold on to. But she supposed a vicar could not be expected to preach quite so precisely, and let the word stand. "You realize," Robert murmured, as they stood afterward accepting the village's congratulations, snow just beginning beyond the church doors, "that I have now made an honest woman of you, before considerably more witnesses than that card table ever held." "You realize," Lydia returned, "that I have now finished a portrait of a man who once told me punctuality came easier to him than most things, and then spent every sitting after that arguing with my instructions. I said punctuality was easy. I never claimed obedience came with it." He drew her hand through his arm. "I find I've grown rather better at sitting still regardless, given sufficient incentive. You'll have to go on sitting still for rather longer than a portrait requires, Your Grace. I understand marriage is considered something of a lengthier commitment." "I'm aware of the terms," he said, drawing her hand through his arm as they walked toward the waiting carriage, snow settling lightly on her bonnet, on his dark coat, on the whole quiet, frost-bright village that had known them both since they were children, and seemed in its own modest way satisfied to see the matter finally settled. "I find I've been preparing for them rather longer than you might think." 2 years later. The portrait hung in the long gallery, finished at last, the eyes rendered exactly as she'd always meant them, steady and certain, nothing held back. Lady Frances had insisted on its placement at the gallery's centre, displacing a third duke of considerably less charm to make room for it, and declared the arrangement an improvement to the room's overall character that she intended to defend against any objection. It was a quiet evening in early spring when Lydia found her husband in the nursery. Their daughter Anne, not yet one, fierce-browed even in sleep, entirely her father's child in temperament, if the midwife's early assessment was to be believed, finally settled after an hour of determined resistance to the entire concept of bedtime. "She fought it admirably," Robert said low, careful not to wake her now that the battle was won. "I begin to suspect we've raised a future general." "How you begin to suspect," Lydia said, coming to stand beside the cradle, "that she takes after her father, who once told me he found punctuality easier than most things, and then proceeded to argue with every instruction I gave him for a fortnight of sittings." "I argued selectively. It's a different skill entirely." She laughed softly, careful of the sleeping child, and let him draw her against his side, the two of them standing a long moment in the candle-lit quiet of the nursery, watching their daughter breathe. "I used to dream about this house," Lydia admitted after I left it. "Not happily at first, but later. I dream of the orchard gate mostly. I never let myself dream past it, into the house itself. I think some part of me never believed I'd be let back in." I'm sorry it took me so long to ask, Robert said. I think of it often, how much of those years we simply lost to my own fear. We didn't lose all of it, she said. I built a life in those years, Robert. A trade, a name that was entirely my own, owed to no one. I wouldn't trade that, even to have had you sooner. I think I needed to become the woman who could walk back through those gates and not be afraid of you, before any of this could properly begin. He was quiet a moment, considering that. I'm not certain I deserve a wife wise enough to find the silver lining in my own cowardice. You don't, she agreed, smiling against his shoulder. But I find I've grown rather fond of you regardless. It's an inconvenient habit. I haven't yet found a way to break it. 2 years after that. The gallery had become, by slow and entirely unplanned degrees, the room the family gathered in of an autumn afternoon. Lady Frances claimed it was the light, though Lydia privately suspected it was simply the portraits, which Lady Frances had taken to narrating for any visiting guest with the enthusiasm of a woman who had appointed herself the household's unofficial historian. Anne, 3 years old now, fierce-browed and utterly undeterred by her own limited skill, knelt on the floor before the hearth with a stub of charcoal, attempting to render the family dog with the great seriousness of a master at work. Her brother James, not yet 2, sat propped against his father's leg, more interested in chewing the corner of a discarded sketchbook page than in any artistic ambitions of his own, occasionally offering a triumphant, wordless shout when he successfully retrieved a page Anne had discarded. "Papa," Anne said, holding up her drawing with the solemn pride of a master presenting a masterpiece, a dog rendered mostly as 4 scribbled legs and 1 ambitious overlarge ear. "Is it finished?" Robert studied the page with the same grave attention he'd once given Lydia's far more accomplished work, turning it this way and that, as though weighing a genuine question of craft. "I think," he said, "that depends entirely on whether you're ready to let it be." Anne considered this with the gravity of a much older critic, glanced once more at her drawing, and then announced with the absolute confidence of the very young, "I'm ready," and set about presenting it instead to the dog himself, who received the honor with considerably less ceremony than the moment seemed to warrant. Lydia, watching from the doorway with a cup of tea gone half-cold in her hand, felt something in her chest settle into the particular, quiet happiness of a story that had finally been allowed to finish exactly as it should. "I'm not the girl you left waiting by the orchard gate," she said softly, coming to stand beside him, echoing words she'd once flung at him in anger and now offered freely, without any sting left in them at all. "No," Robert agreed, drawing her hand into his eyes on their children, on the finished portrait, on the whole unlikely, hard-won shape of the life they'd built. "You never were. I only wish I'd had the sense to see it the first time, instead of the second." "You saw it in time," Lydia said. "That's all any of us are owed in the end, not the first chance, just one that holds." James, abandoning his sketchbook page at last, crawled determinedly toward the hearthrug to inspect his sister's dog drawing at closer range, and Anne, with the magnanimity of an artist confident in her own genius, allowed him to hold one corner of the paper as though he'd contributed something essential to its creation. Outside, the first chill of autumn moved through the park, gold-leaved and quiet, settling over Holloway Court exactly as it had every season for 300 years, except that this year, as in every year since the small stone church and the falling snow, every room in that house carried the particular warmth of a story that had, at last, been allowed to finish.